this is Niswander, and welcome to the Nowman Show. I am here today with Dr. Lisabeth Ryder, George Callis, and also Eric Boyd. Dr. Lisabeth Ryder has been a mechanic and a small business owner, a university teacher, an anthropologist, and database analyst and computer programmer. She has also been a lifelong social justice, environmental, and human rights activist, and has been involved in both community and political organizing. She has worked for organized labor over 2 decades, having worked with both SEIU and AFSCME. She has been involved in cooperatives since the early 1970s and co-chairs the Union Co-op Council for the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Plus, she's the organizer for LUCI, the Los Angeles Union Cooperative Initiative. She is a graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor George Callis teaches political science, history, and government at the Miramar Community College in San Diego. He's also the political research consultant and executive producer of financial-related productions of the WSDE, Worker Self-Directed Enterprise, Arete Media Productions, and is the lead for Democracy at Work San Diego. Eric Boyd is a lifelong athlete and a coach, competing and coaching currently in CrossFit and weightlifting. He is also a co-owner of Interactive Fitness Systems, a local gym that is working towards becoming a worker cooperative and is working to form another co-op, the Platform Co-op Investment Club, an international investment club looking to help platform startups which wish to incorporate cooperative principles. He's also the co-lead for Democracy at Work Pasadena. Now let's go into just a little bit of history this time around. We can elaborate on it much more down the road. I know, Eric, you'd be really good with that. But let's just get into the real basics right now for our audience, just to get introduced. Now, Liz, you mentioned briefly about the Knights of Labor.
Mm-hmm. So, post-Civil War, the original labor movement, American labor movement, it's called the Knights of Labor, and they're really the origin of a lot of our cooperatives. And it started off in the center of the country. You know, it started off in states. The populist movement started in the middle of the country, but labor movement's always been industrial, so it's always been in the cities. Yeah, it's their original mission, and there's a wonderful book that you can get to read about it. It's called For All the People, and it's written by John Curl, C-U-R-L. And the mission of the Knights of Labor was to create a cooperative economy. So, and this is what I call the larger labor movement. It's before we had labor unions as we know them today. And so when people went on strike, when they were trying to organize a union, you had to provide. And so people would form small worker cooperatives to sustain themselves while people are out on strike. So it's a natural fit between the labor movement and worker cooperatives.
And then also too, you had mentioned in a PowerPoint presentation a quote, that it started basically with hat makers, bakers, and garment workers, and they were designed to, quote, like, cope with the evils of unbridled capitalism and the insecurities of wage labor, end quote.
Yeah, they don't
I
mince
had
words.
to say that. Yes,
thank you
right.
for not mincing words.
Yeah, thank you for not mincing the words. So now you mentioned also the populist movement that happened after the Civil War, basically. And then, of course, coming up to, like, for instance, the 1950s, there was a lot of activity in the Basque region of Spain and also in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. And I just want to cover that real quickly. Mondragon began after the Spanish Civil War and World War II.
Yes.
And it was started by a Catholic priest, actually, Father Arizmendi, who famously has said, why we're not going to wait for the recovery to come to us, because if we do, we'll be dead.
Right.
He literally said that, and that was why they started very small, maybe like a half a dozen people, right? And now we'll get into how they've grown later, but that's how they started. And so in the United States, the last information that I have, there are approximately 30,000 cooperatives. with 2 million people involved. Now, I don't know how many of those people are actually considered workers. You could probably...
Well, those are not worker cooperatives. Those are all types of cooperatives.
Yes.
So
Yes.
some of them are cooperatively owned businesses, some of them are other types of cooperatives,
Yeah.
but not all the cooperatively owned businesses are worker cooperatives, and therefore they do not hold to the principle of one worker, one vote, one share.
Yes,
I believe
exactly.
the vast majority are not.
Vast majority are not.
That's the vast majority are not. There's also here the Evergreen Cooperatives or Cleveland, I guess, cooperative. They have laundry, solar, hydroponics, cooperative home care. CC Puede.
Si se puede.
Yeah, I think I've heard Richard Wolff talk about that. They're in Brooklyn.
Housekeeping
Yeah.
cooperative. Yeah.
Yeah, and
There's
then-
Wages also is in the Bay Area. It's created housekeeping cooperatives.
And of course, there's a plywood processing company, and the Labour Party in the UK has talked about it, and I have to do more research in finding out about that. And then Land O'Lakes, the butter company. Of course, we mentioned REI.
Well, that's not a worker cooperative, though.
That's
It's a
not
consumer
That's a
cooperative.
consumer cooperative.
New Era Windows and Doors is also a worker cooperative that came out of a union strike, out of a union process. Yeah. Many worker cooperatives come out of union strikes and union actions.
Yeah.
Union Cab in Madison, Wisconsin came out of a union strike.
Wow.
And that's actually has been portrayed in that very famous documentary, The Take, about the Argentinian,
Yeah.
I believe
Oh, wow.
it
I
was
was
a
gonna
tile
say that-
factory that
Yeah.
they took over.
That entire movement that started with what do they call the company? Or I think the major example was Fábricas Sin Patrones, which is the
Yeah.
previously Zanon, and they had, I think it was several years of the business not turning a profit and having just IMF loan after IMF loan keep them afloat. And the country finally said, you know what, we're done with this IMF thing, and the capitalist ownership of that group folded, and the corporation, or the workers took over and actually occupied the factory and had to actually, like, there were some military excursions trying to get them out of there.
That's right. That's right.
And
that's right.
and they finally
Yeah.
won legal ownership. They turned a profit, I think by threefold. And that was just one example of like 200 plus factories in Argentina that had become, cooperatives, and that movement is still going.
Armed with slingshots.
Armed with slingshots. and
balls of clay.
Yes.
Balls of clay,
And that, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that movement also inspired a cooperative auto factory. I think that actually took over in the same manner.
Yes.
Do you know a little bit more about
It's
that?
the topic of the movie, The Take. So one should view the movie, because I think
Right.
visuals, when you see eyes on, you can
Yes.
see how serious this
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
That was a really good
They did auto
documentary for
brakes,
sure.
I believe.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. And of course, here in Los Angeles, Pacific Electric.
Pacific
And
Co-op Electric?
I actually reached out to Somerset Waters. He's on vacation at the moment, so maybe down the road we'll get him in here to talk about
He's
his.
part of the LA Eco Village.
That's right,
So
that's
these
right.
are, partners in,
Yeah.
in the movement.
I'm very familiar with that story, and then also the Vermont Gauge Car Wash, which we can go into in future episodes. Maybe meet some of these people. There's the Arizmendi coffee shops in the Bay Area. Obviously named after the father Arizmendi, who started Mondragon in Spain. And international cooperatives. There's Lega Loop in Milan that was started in 1886. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. And they focus on housing, consumer, retailer, production, tourism, and agriculture. Now, here's an interesting subject, which I would say is an example of policy that has made a humongous impact in the economy in Italy with worker cooperatives. And it was put into law over 30 years ago. It's called the Marcora Law. And essentially what that is that if you, for whatever reasons, lost your job, and you found maybe 10 other people, also in a similar situation, they would give you all of what we would call here in the United States of your unemployment money, and you could form a worker cooperative, and the government would give you all the resources that they possibly could give you to help you be a success. And the Marcora Law has not only been very successful, Italy now has more worker cooperatives than any other country in the world. I think it's largely because of the Marquardt Law myself. And of course, you know, there are capitalist organizations, but guess what? They want to get rid of that law. Now, again, I'm going to make a judgment here. To me, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, okay? So there's also Summa Whole Foods in the UK, which is a whole food wholesaler, distributor of vegetarian food, natural foods, organic, fair trade. And we're going to end this segment on Mondragon in Spain. As I mentioned, it started in the 1950s. As of July 2017, there are 261 businesses and cooperatives, 75,335 employees,
Worker owners,
15 technology centers, and there are, if you go to their website, you can see that they have offices and partnerships all over the world.
They have a business in the Bay Area, from what I understand.
Yep. Let's watch now a video of Professor Richard Wolff. This is from a lecture he did in Hollywood at the Musicians Union in 2014 about the advantages of worker cooperatives.
If the workers together decide whether a company leaves town, guess what? They're not going to leave. If you were afforded the opportunity to keep your job here in LA or to have one on the outskirts of Shanghai, my guess is, in most cases, you'd prefer to stay here. You want to deal with the problem of export of jobs, democratize the enterprise, like that. Here's another example. A toxic technology that makes more profits but really fouls the earth. If the company decides, the board of directors, they choose the profitability because that's their pressure. But if the workers themselves decide, would they be interested in more profits? Sure. But they'd also be worried about what they and their spouses and their children and their neighbors have to breathe or drink or eat. And you're going to see some ecological sensitivity of the sort we never see here. And here's the big one. What's the biggest source of income and wealth inequality in America? It's the distribution of profits. It's not the occasional athlete or actress who gets a wild salary. It's the way we distribute the surplus, the profits. In a modern corporation, remember I told you we'd come back to this. In a modern corporation, the board of directors decides how to distribute the surplus. And, surprise, surprise, they give a lot of it to themselves in sky-high executive salaries. Suppose the distribution of the surplus were decided democratically. You think the workers democratically would decide to give 4 or 5 individuals everything while everybody else has to borrow to put their kid through college? Unlikely. You want to do something about inequality? Let's not have the umpteenth war on poverty by the umpteenth president, none of which work. We're in the 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, and we got precious little to show. You want to do something about inequality of income and wealth, then don't keep inventing laws and rules to redistribute the wealth and the income. Don't maldistribute it in the first place. Then you won't have to have a debate about which is the better way to redistribute. Don't do that. Don't allow it to be distributed that way in the first place. And a democratic distribution, and what am I asking for? All the workers together produce the profit by their efforts. Nothing would be more obvious than to let all of those who contributed to produce them decide what to do with them. Not only would it undo the inequality that tortures us as a nation, not only would it realize democracy, but it would mean we had finally outgrown and overcome the capitalist organization of enterprises that explains the rise, the decline, and the crisis of this system.
All right. So my question, let's start with Liz. Why would you say that worker cooperatives, or as Wolff would refer to as worker self-directed enterprises, are preferable to capitalist ones? Give us some examples.
Well, you have to take this from 2 points of view. Obviously, it's an advantage for the workers because they have a greater share and greater decision making. The question is, why is it an advantage to entrepreneurs? Because startups happen because of entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs are very special people. They're very self-directed. They usually, especially in American culture, they just like, I want to get it done. I don't want anybody, I don't want to have to sit through meetings. I don't want to have to talk to anybody about it. I'm just going to take care of it myself. They're very individualistic, and that's our culture. Now, why would it appeal to an entrepreneur? Okay, so there are certain business advantages that, that when you're talking to an entrepreneur, you should bring up. One of it is that accessibility. If I'm going to open up a bakery and it takes $200,000 to open up the bakery, and I'm checking my pockets, don't have $200,000 in my pocket. If you get 10 people involved, you distribute both the investment and the risk. Because when you're a startup, you're going to be having to put a mortgage on your house, you're going to have to sell your car, you're going to have to borrow from your family. You'll have to do less of that if you've distributed it.
Yeah.
So then the idea of becoming an entrepreneur becomes more accessible to more people. So that's one advantage. Now, I was a small business owner myself. My first husband and I had an auto repair business, and I'll tell you, after 7 years, I was tired.
Yeah.
Because you're working 60-hour weeks, 7 days a week, especially for the first couple of years. So reduce burnout. If you have somebody, a group of people who are all as much engaged as you are, knowledgeable about how the business runs, able to make decisions on their own, as well as empowered to make those decisions, then if you have 12 people, one person can be on vacation each month. So that reduces burnout. I didn't have a vacation for years when I was running my own business, so it is a real issue. It's why many businesses only last 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, it's just way too much work.
One of the most important things is every sole entrepreneurship enters into a crisis of leadership at some point in its history. And the reason is, of course, because at some point, the leader, the person who started that, the entrepreneur, is going to move on. Now, it could be, that they're retiring. There are many retiring now. The baby boomers are all retiring. And so now you enter into a crisis leadership. Who's going to lead that forward? Who knows the business? Who can run it? Who can make those sorts of decisions? Who's been that engaged? A worker cooperative has the natural process of change of personnel built into the design. So you never have that crisis of leadership, which is why worker cooperatives last longer than most small businesses. All these reasons, distributed risk, all these things contribute to the fact that worker cooperatives actually last longer. So they're better for our economy because, when a small business closes because he can't pass it off to his children or sell it, we try to turn it into a worker cooperative. But if we can't, then, 20 people out of a job. So it's better for our economy that we build structures that have a natural inborn mechanism for the change of personnel. Now, in Mondragon, we saw an example where you can see that the business advantage of a worker cooperative, because in the challenging economic situations of 2008, they made a decision. They made a decision to go to 80% of their salary because they knew they could also make the decision to return to 100%. In the current labor movement, you would never do that because you know that the bosses would never let you back. You could never get it back.
That's right.
But they are more versatile. They can make those decisions, and in these volatile economic situations, they can make a decision to make themselves more economically viable because they're in the driver's seat. Okay, there's also, detailed things such as, there's an IRS tax code called subchapter T that applies to.
Yeah, what is that? I saw that in the.
I'm not a tax expert, so. But it has to do with corporate taxes. So, corporate, you have your taxes that are you're taxed at the corporate level, and then once you're distributed, then you're taxed at the personal level. But the worker cooperative, what happens is you're only taxed as it's distributed as you essentially quote unquote dividends, which is what the capitalist terminology would be. And so because it is a cooperative, you don't have that corporate tax, the same type of corporate taxation. I don't want to get into more details because I'm not knowledgeable enough.
Yeah.
So, here you have a transparency of decision-making, more increased job security, and a real sense of ownership where people are more participatory. These are all business advantages that lead to the fact that this business is more viable and will last longer.
Yeah, exactly. In the case that you were pointing out about Mondragon, in 2008, of course, there was a global crisis,
Yes.
global economic crisis, which, by the way, we're still in. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to, there are those moments I'm going to be very frank with you, okay?
Yeah. Well, there was 28% unemployment in the rest
Yeah.
of Spain,
Yeah.
but not in Mondragon.
That's right.
Because they didn't lose a job.
That's right.
There were companies that had to go bankrupt. Matter of fact, their flagship, Fagor, was a casualty of that. I think they actually went into bankruptcy a few years later. But because of the downturn in the real estate and building construction, Fagor had manufactured appliances. And
Oh,
so
they did
yes,
go into
and-
bankruptcy.
Yes,
Oh,
they
I
did.
didn't know that.
But what they did is they took the workers, retrained them, and put them into other worker
Yes,
cooperatives.
yes.
So
Yes,
no job loss.
yes. Another advantage.
Yes, this is
So
flexibility.
because you're in a capitalist corporation, you just say, sorry,
Up the
maybe we'll
street.
give you a severance package, goodbye.
So that's actually an interesting point, because what's happening is you have an economic community formed where, like you say, you can transfer people within the community, and they'll always be able to apply their skills, talents, and productivity. In this system,
Right.
you wind up at the unemployment office,
That's right.
Right.
and you're kind of on a life raft on your own, so you're separated out.
That's right.
Okay, so you see this very interesting concept in the culture of the democratizing effect. Within a community, you have mutual support.
That's right.
Okay, it's like one for all for one. But in this system here, everybody is isolated or alienated out into the community.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's each person for themselves rather
Right.
than a sense of being together as one.
Right.
You
Well, I
survive
think
on
that
your own.
what we have to make people aware of is that we have one business model. It's the exploitative capitalist business model, and we think that's the only possible business model. What Mondragon has demonstrated for us is that there's an alternative business model. Yes, having profits and within the business is important. It's how you grow more businesses. But what they've done is they've put people before profits. They've said, look, we need to have jobs for our community members, and so they were flexible enough to reduce their salary for a period of time so that the other businesses did not go out of business, so that everybody could keep their job.
Right.
That became the priority. The way that corporate law is written in the United States is that if you're not constantly showing a profit, you're actually violating
That's
corporate
right.
law.
That's
so we
right.
have to change the nature of our business model and our corporate law so that the maximum number of people benefit, not just a few.
That's right.
So
And-
that's a massive transformation of the whole capitalist legal system.
Yeah, that's
And-
right.
And that's a political issue.
That is a political issue, which we're going to get into.
We're gonna get into later.
Yes.
More and more as we go further into this. You'll see. Now, then they also corporations tend to push down wages and benefits,
Right.
because they need to cut corners because it's all about making profits for the shareholders, which are not directly, in most cases, connected to the day-to-day workplace anyway. And they also would like to externalize costs. I know you and I
Right,
talked about
absolutely.
that
Yes.
like the cost of pollution. So if they're polluting the environment, and if there's any ramifications for that, then they want to pass those costs on to the
To public.
taxpayers.
Healthcare.
And healthcare, more and more. I mean, I remember how that process worked. I literally went from getting free healthcare to little by little you pay a premium, and then you go to an HMO, and you
Right.
and you see things changing where you can't see your own personal doctor as often or at all, and it becomes more corporatized, less personalized, and and another thing too is that people don't talk about a whole lot, but the Bush tax cuts. You know what I mean? Because we borrow, we're constantly borrowing, for our just outrageous military budget, right? And then want to cut back on social programs. So for a long, long time, we were borrowing from China. So when the Bush tax cuts came along, they were set to expire when Obama came into office. And then the reason why Obama didn't discontinue it is because the rich people had a business plan, as they always do, and they said, so how about you let us keep the tax cut, right? And with that money, then we can loan that to you, so you don't have to borrow from the Chinese. That'd still be good for you politically, right? Because then you can tell your constituents we're not borrowing from China, right? So that sounds good. But what you're actually doing then is passing the the bill onto the taxpayer like you and me, because of course because it's a corporation and by law they have to make a profit and they have to show it, so they're going to charge an interest rate, which is going to get passed on to the average taxpayer, and again, they don't have to pay any more tax. So this is something that the average person doesn't understand, how capitalism creates externalized costs to people that really don't have the money.
Right. They externalize the cost of doing business onto the public budget.
That's
and
right.
have the taxpayers pay for what are their business operating expenses.
That's
and
right.
so the whole corporate employment operates because of these principles of pushing down wages and benefits. They take our entrepreneurs, what used to be family-owned businesses, who are all been involved in family-owned businesses, they put them out of business. Walmart has put more family businesses out of business, which are essentially the same principle of worker cooperative, right? If your family's running it. They put those out of business, and then those people have to become low wage earners, and so they're constantly pushing it down, making temporary, making them part-time, pushing down the wages and benefits, externalizing the costs, making more and more profit. And where do those profits go, by the way?
Yes, exactly.
Do they go into the local community?
No.
Okay, so you have the profits going somewhere else. It could
Which
be
we don't
Germany.
even know where they are.
Could
right,
be China.
exactly.
It could be New York City, or
right.
whatever. But it's not going to the local community
That's
in a
right.
variety of ways.
That's right.
It's not being paid into the local tax pool.
That's right.
You wonder why our infrastructure, why our education is being starved. It's because of this corporate employment is operating as this pump to pump wealth out of our communities. If the business is owned locally, money gets spent locally. Your wages
right.
get spent locally. It recirculates within the community. Other small businesses are used to be sourcing their services and goods to supply that small business. So it's recirculating. And this is the principle that Mondragon has really refined, is that their wealth circulates within their community, their entire community.
Yes. And it's the whole Basque region.
Yes,
My
it is.
South
The
of
entire
Spain.
region is benefited.
Well,
And
Interestingly, me and my conservative father, when I was younger, would actually, that was one of the biggest things that we could actually agree on.
yes.
Was especially talking about Walmart and other companies like that, who
Right.
would come into communities and just bleed the communities of small businesses and of the wealth.
Right.
Here we are in the second biggest crisis. We're not establishing Social Security, we're cutting it. We're not extending unemployment benefits, we just finished cutting them off. And we don't even discuss a public employment program. Wow. It's all been undone. So here was the mistake. You cannot solve the contradictions, the catastrophes, the crises of capitalism. You cannot undo the abandonment of North America, Western Europe, and Japan in the way I described, unless you deal with the organization of the enterprise. Who makes the decisions for what purposes about the daily functioning of an enterprise? If you don't deal with that, then the people who are in charge, the major shareholders and the boards of directors, will move out of the country, will undo the federal rules and regulations, and keep producing crises the way capitalism always has. Capitalism has been dominant for 250 years. It has never solved economic crisis. Roosevelt made speech after speech in which he said, my policies will not only get us out of the Great Depression, but they will make sure that no future downturn like this will afflict our children. That was a promise he made, but he could not keep it. Every president since Roosevelt, including Obama, has promised the same. My policies will get us out of the downturn and will make sure this never happens again. None of them has ever delivered on this promise. They can't, because to deliver on that promise, even though they don't understand it, means to undo the system that presents us with the problem.